Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. This is John with Tommy's Top Picks here to bring you your 2.0 update, I guess we're calling it now. Just wanted to go into some things here before we get started. Appreciate the likes and subscribes. We're about 50% of viewers are subscribers, so really appreciate that, at least on a bunch of the market update stuff. So that's what I've been watching. Let's go ahead and jump into the box of Uprising. Really enjoying this product still. Looking forward to the meta and how it's adapting. Very interesting stuff happening there, but that's not for today. That is for the Thursday content. So let's go ahead and jump into the 2.0 situation, what's happening so far, how these prices are reacting. Individual boxes are at map, so I think either last week or in one of the updates it had fallen below map. Quite a bit. I don't know if LSS reached out or the market just absorbed it or what, but it is now back at $80 a box. So that's, where it should be, honestly. It shouldn't be below that at this stage in the game until 180 days out. So that's doing what it should. That's kind of not surprising because we know LSS has done some enforcement stuff around that. The cases are still reasonable. Again, kind of at map. I think they're $1 below or something like that. The staples are all still holding price. So think your Crown of Providence, Rainbow Foil, Flame Scale Furnace, Rainbow Foil are all over the $100 mark, so not super cheap. That's just because they're critical staples. This is a time of competitiveness. People need those cards. There's no real replacement for them in the optimized decks, etc. Shuko has come down below 100 because it was holding above 100 for quite some time, and it does seem to have flatlined at the rainbow foil mark of about $86. So it was, I think it was, I can't remember, 150, 120, something like that. It was up there for a while because I guess it was the hotness. It's definitely still in high demand. It's one of the cards that moves quite a bit. But now we're starting to see a shift in the market from playables into the collectible as far as volume. So the two I mentioned first, or sorry, the three. So Crown of Providence, Flame Scale Furnace, and Shuko are definitely the three that are moving the most as far as units sold in Rainbow Foil. Nice, Flame Scale Furnace, as we're talking about. And so that's great. And that's obviously driven by playable because it's a rainbow foil. You're not collecting those, I doubt. The Blood of Drakai is also in the top 4 cards as far as numbers being sold. So that's important to note. That is in rainbow foil. So I guess people are playing it. Now, I will say, unlike the other ones which have pretty much flatlined, like found their price, gone up even in some cases, like the Crown of Providence, the rainbow foil Blood of Drakai is still drifting lower every week, every day. It seems to be selling at a lower level. And that's rainbow foil. We'll get into the collectible side in a minute. The other one that is of reasonable demand, so kind of I'll call them the tier 2 demand for playable, because again, rainbow foil, is a race face, obviously, Coronet Peak, and oddly Ghostly Touch. Anyone have a clue on that one for me? Because I don't understand it. I don't see it as super good playability. I could be wrong on that. I just don't see popping happening a lot, but I don't play a lot of different metas, so I could be wrong. Leave a comment if you know, like, Ghostly Touch is just killer in this deck, blah, 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 do it this way, and it's just the way it goes or something. Maybe in some of those Prism decks? I don't know. If you know, let me know. I would like to know. And then you get down to the Alluvian Constellus, which is a staple card for, I believe, Icelander. She uses it in the Wizard matchups, and probably is the case for Kano, although less useful because of the way it works, the charges versus the payment, how much you get out of it. It's 3 resource gained to use your staff, and Icelander is the more expensive staff, so it seems like it leans towards her as the current tech. But anyways, it's the least demand of the legendaries that are in the best selling category at the top page, basically. So that's something to keep in mind. What I am seeing is volume is picking up around, switching gears now into the collectible side of things, around the Marvels and fancy collectible things. So let's go through those a little bit piece by piece here. The first thing is the Fable is just flatline. It had a moment where it dipped below 300, but it's essentially holding at 300, steady 315 kind of range for the cold foil Fable. The Providence has gone up. It has done nothing but gone up. The cold foil crown of Providence has just gone up the whole time. And I don't know where its top is going to be. It is currently sitting at about $200. It seems hard to come by. It seems rare. And because it's a generic equipment, it seems solid. So people are just holding on. Nice quilling sleeves. So it's one of those things where we're going to see that find its top at some point, and then probably reverse, I would guess, based on that, the available number total. But I could be wrong on that because it is a generic. It may just hold demand for a long time. I will be keeping an eye on that because I do want to get a good deal on that, but it's crazy. It's hard to predict now. Now, of the other things, your flame scale furnaces, etc., there's a bunch of them that were dropping. They had bottomed and then were going back up. The flame scale furnace cold foil is still going up at this point. So it's at that check mark stage where I usually would buy. But we'll see how it progresses, because what I've noticed is, I believe it was Tomotai or Dominia, one of them had done the same thing, but now is reversing and going back down. So one of the Marvel Dragons had its peak, dropped down into a gully, rose back up, which is when I got a little worried that I missed the bottom, but now it's starting to descend again. So what I would say is the less usable cards are going to start doing the reverse to the mean kind of downward trend as product gets out there, boxes open, etc. And then what happens from there is the more playable cards will probably follow suit over time as there's less interest in this, less competition need for them, people that have it or need it for their competitive blitzy deck or blingy deck. They have it. There's no more demand for it. It kind of dries up or it slows down, and that's a good time to buy. At least that's what I'm speculating on personally. None of this is financial advice, obviously, but it's interesting to see. It is playing very differently than historic versions, the unlimited version and the limited version of the boxes. So I like it. It does seem to be supporting the collectible cards at a good value. So good job overall. Props to LSS on this. I think the 2.0 thing is pretty much working as intended. Obviously, some of the cards, the Marvel Dragons that aren't the top tier playable dragons, they're really cheap, but that's playability. It's a playable driven game, so it's going to be the way it is, right? They're still reasonable. I mean, $35 card for one of the tier 2, the Calorian Dragon, that's not nothing, right? And the worst ones are like $10 or $15. Again, not nothing. In a Magic game, a $10 card is a hit, right? Clearly. Anything over $2 is a hit. So they are hits, and they're fairly frequent to get them. Now, this is where I'm curious what Louis' next update is. I think it's next week. For EV versus value of cards. Is this still overvalued? Do we expect these numbers to come down significantly? The ones that are holding at the low end? That's a good question, and that I don't know the answer to. I do know a lot of the special stuff, Reverse Rewind is still holding up. Your cold foil Frost Hex is still holding up. Your extended art for Phoenix Form is still holding up. Granted, that's the majestic one. The other ones are really, really cheap because they're commons, right? So my point is that there's a section of this market that is collectible, holding value, and I'm going to try to time it a little bit to get the best price I can, but I think they will overall hold some value in the long run because they're chase cards. They did a good job at making them chase cards, but accessible. So that's my take so far. We will continue to follow this as we do more of these, and then from there we'll dig in and see how the overall market reacts, etc. So let's go ahead and switch topics here. Okay, let's jump into the rambly part of this a little bit. I want to kind of follow up on the topic from last week, which, if you recall, was about the, the entrenched interest versus the more dynamic, faster moving interests in any particular space. You can talk about it in the form of governments, empires, kingdoms, businesses, cardboard empires, right? Things like that. And one of the things that I don't think I brought to a close on that conversation was that 2.0 is a demonstration of exactly what I was talking about, how the smaller interests, the newer, are more dynamic and able to adapt to changing market conditions. And given the right sort of shakes, it can be enough, shakes in that, lattice of economic interconnectedness that I was describing. It can be enough to take out or take place of one of the bigger entrenched first, top tier players. Again, I don't see this happening quickly, especially in the cardboard space. There's a lot of reasons for that. But it does show, 2.0 does show that LSS is that dynamic actor, right? It's able to adapt its business model quickly and in reaction to what's happening in the markets, and it has been doing so actively, which is a good sign. It's one of the reasons I have a lot of faith in LSS, despite the various missteps along the way. It's because they are adapting to the missteps, whereas Magic is moving and changing a little bit as well, but it doesn't seem like they're adapting to their missteps as frequently or as successfully. That's probably the best way to frame that. So it's something to think about. But let's jump into the macro topic a little bit that ties a little bit to it. So I was talking about these, entrenched periods and then these times of dynamic shift. The idea that Silicon Valley does disruptive technology in general. I want to take it a step further back, kind of a broader scale, because I mentioned kings and empires and stuff and how this all plays into it. And one of the things that I've realized over the years of kind of examining this stuff is that there's pretty much three pillars of socioeconomic transformation and stability. And if any one of those three pillars gets rocked for some reason, like a transformation in technology that affects it, then what we typically see is a transformation of power and or hegemony. So the hegemony of the lead actor in the world, in the space, in the whatever, right? And so a way to think about it is there's many times in history where we have singular monopolies that dominate entire industry. You can think East Indian Trade Company. You can think the big oil companies back in the day, the telcos in that time period. There's always these dominant players that come to rule over an industry, and then they get very lax. And then transformation happens, undercuts them, and they fall. And that's in economics. It happens also in politics and power of the world. So you think about the fall of the Roman Empire, the transformation of the UK, sun never sets on it, to the US dominance, There's a million different examples. But the three pillars that tend to be heralds of those transformations are energy, information, and finance. And from my examination, the majority of the time, not all the time, but the majority of the time in history, if one of those is vastly transformed due to some sort of technology change or cultural change that just is a faster, more efficient way of doing the thing, then the other two will be transformed shortly thereafter by the transition of power to the new power. And if some entity, be it a business or a government or an empire or whatever, is able to essentially grasp the control of the new version, or at least are dominant in the production and development of the new version of one of those three pillars, then what ends up happening is they end up taking over as the global power, or the big monopoly, or the main player, the dominant force, if you will, in the market. So let's talk about some examples and why that makes sense. So all these things end up tying to transportation. I don't know if that will hold true going forward, because a lot of stuff is able to be transported essentially digitally these days. And if you think about what the three pillars are, energy, information, and finance, you can start to think about examples in history when this has happened. But so an example of the transportation effect, right? Insurance on shipping. When that first happened, that actually was the beginning of what ultimately became stock markets. There was some lenders that would put insurance on shipping sale days, back in the sale days, so that if a ship went down, there was still, financial solvency, even though the goods got, failed. And there's an entire industry built around that, and then it slowly became more advanced banking, and then eventually that's what led to the stock market existing. Coal power ships is an example of the transportation affected by energy change. So you can think about how the age of the sail ended and coal and powered ships became dominant and what that did to shipping networks, logistics, etc. And then, of course, for the finance side of things, again, transportation and how it played into it. So you can think of transportation as a carrier of those transformations. And I'm done here with the deck after this. I mean, the cards after this. So just sit back and relax, or whatever. If you don't like this stuff, you can turn it off. That's fine too. The network of riders in banking. I think there's an Italian bank family that had a network of riders all throughout Europe, and they got information. I believe it was about Napoleon's success or failure in a battle, and they had so many riders positioned to transform information or transport information from the front line to the various banks throughout Europe, because I think they had branches in like 3 or 4 countries, and make financial decisions, essentially investments, bets, etc., in areas that hadn't gotten the information yet. So it's a lack of informational parity in the market. And because of that, they became a dominant bank family for the next, hundreds of years, right? Long time. And that's how they rose to power, was through this transportation network for information. So you got to think that's the information part as well. But it was the riders that allowed that information to travel quickly. And that's where the transportation ties into both the information and finance component. This asymmetrical information component comes up again and again in history. There was another example of a similar thing. I think there was a bank run, I want to say it was the 1800s, and there was a bank run that maybe started in Asia or something, and caught fire in California, I believe, and this individual jumped on his horse. His bank was on the East Coast or something of that nature, jumped on his horse, rode across the country, and I don't know if this is fictional. It's one of those stories that's told about this, and got to the other side of the country before the information did, before the ships could sail around, because there was no Panama Canal at the time. Ships could sail around and spread the information, because most information came through shipping at that point. And so he beat the ships there, which means he beat the information there, and was able to withdraw his money from the bank on the East Coast before the bank run shut them down. So just examples of this like asymmetry in information having impacts on markets and how they play out. So that's just a framework of it. Socioeconomics, 3 pillars: energy, information, finance, tied to transportation always, because transportation is key. Transportation might not be as much of a factor going forward just because of the digital components of things. But you can't count it out. Obviously, our logistics networks are affected right now by transportation, right? Shipping, ports, etc. I don't think they teach this in Emperor School in this framework, but it does seem to be emergent because it's a repeated pattern throughout history. And so what I'm thinking is, just as a emperor or king, you are motivated motivated to act in your best interest and your country's best interest. Sometimes they are tied together, sometimes not. And essentially what ends up happening is when you see one of these transformations occur, you either seize it and evolve, or you don't and are one of the falling powers. So I think it's just a national need, and if you think about all those examples I just gave, and I'll give a few more in a second, they all come back to the staples, and the staples tend to be the things that affect later and further industries. So as an emperor or mogul or whatever, you have interest in these other products, therefore you're worried about those inputs that play into those secondary products, right? So here's a couple of examples. Greek time period up until Roman time period, I believe they considered the Mediterranean was run on olive oil. And it wasn't, I don't think it was burned. I think it was mostly for cooking, and cooking is energy and fuel for soldiers, which was important. And I believe it was very transportable, and you could cook pretty easily, go into enemy territory, grab their grain, use the oil to cook with, make bread, etc. I think they did flatbreads and stuff. Bread and circuses was definitely a combination of energy and information in the form of entertainment. which was the early stage propaganda, because they would reenact battles to make Rome, and this is in Rome, make Rome appear more mighty and better than everyone else, to get people to feel this nationalistic pride, etc. So again, information and energy playing into it. As long as the people are fed, they go along with it. If they're entertained and told that everything is great, then they believe it. During the age of the sail, you had the rubber transportation, but from Africa, which was horrific if you read about it. There's a couple of really good books on it, but it was just terrible, the things that were done. But ultimately, it did lead to a lot of industrialization because of the availability of rubber. People started to invent new and different ways of both transportation and energy, which ultimately led into I guess the end of the age of coal, if you will, because age of coal had already started at that point. And that transformed into the age of oil, which there's some times in World War I when that became a critical factor in the very existence of the war itself and why it was started. And then later in World War II, the entire Middle East rewriting of the boundaries was heavily based on oil and Western power interests in that oil. So all those things come into play as these transformations happen from one empire to another, dominant industry, dominant players, etc. And you can see it, like I said, again and again, repeat through history. Sometimes it's a corporation, sometimes it's a king, sometimes it's a democracy, sometimes it's a whatever, right? We do see this happening yet again. This is another factor. It was slower in the past, sometimes hundreds of years between major transformations. It is speeding up, so I think it does tie to our technological development. I do think we are in an age of faster and faster technological development, and I think that is making these transformations more likely to happen. To tie back to the other point about Silicon Valley and its entire thesis of trying to be disruptive, it's now like a thing that you chase explicitly, right? So it's not just something that naturally happens over time, it's something that we try to achieve with purpose. And you're starting to see this, and there's three areas currently that are interesting for modern times. You have cryptocurrency, which is the digital transformation of finance. You have social media, which is another digital transformation of information. So you start with internet being kind of a transportation of information being more efficient, right? And then you build on top of it social media, which is a way to consolidate power, influence, etc. of information, much like circuses in the Roman times, where it's a thing that people can stay obsessed with and interested in and continually paying attention to, and then you can use that to slowly change the way they think in the minds that are viewing it, which we're seeing happen all the time. And then the third area is the energy component, which is renewables. We are now at a point where solar is the cheapest form of energy in the history of humankind. I believe that's an actual fact. I heard that recently. I have looked into it, and it makes sense because over the past 20 years of solar power being a fact, it has followed Moore's law, which is that, I think I was talking about it last time, basically every 18 months, give or take, silicon, in this case it's wafer production, there it was chip production, it cuts in half the price to produce it, and it doubles in capacity. In this case, I think it's voltaic kilowatt hours or something like that, instead of processing power for processors. But point being that it has followed Moore's law. It is continually logarithmically and deflationarily going through that process. And what ends up happening, if you have a deflationary energy input, that means ultimately everything becomes cheaper to do with more energy, being available for cheaper. We're reaching this very interesting turning point where it's about to transform the entire world, because energy is a major input. That's why wars are fought over oil, etc. And it's a big deal, and it always has been. Like I said, back to the Roman and Greek times, if you didn't have the olive oil, if you didn't have the ability to fuel your armies, you were unable to succeed on the battlefield in expansion or defense, right? very important. Still to this day, very important. Anyone who studies logistics knows it's very important. This is why people talk about the price of a barrel of oil, because that is a direct number that ties to so many other industries. They all rely on oil. Well, this is going to change now. Now, when? How fast? There's a lot of entrenched interests that don't want it to change, and there's a lot of dynamic, transformative interests that are trying to change it. So it's an interesting battle of wills. Obviously, it would be better for our planet and our survival as a species if we transform faster, but money doesn't care about those things. So it's one of those things where it's like human nature gets in the way of itself. So anyways, that's a long way to go through some interesting concepts that I like to think about and kind of frame out how these bigger things play out, which of course impacts everything, including how much it costs to ship cardboard from a production facility in China to our country. Or Belgium, I think, right? Belgium printers, Japan printers, those are the main ones. So if you think about it, when we talk about people air shipping cardboard pallets because the shipping ports are clogged, these are all the factors that we're talking about. And I just gave the big framework on how this all plays out over human history, but it actually does tie right into what we're talking about. And then the other factor is the 2.0. By not having massive production at the front end, you don't have to worry about having excess stock. You can do it in waves to demand, which of course has its downsides too, but it can become a little bit smoother of a curve around a release. Very interesting stuff. All ties together, if you ask me. It is very abstract. I hope I did not bore you. If you enjoy this content, hit the like button. Let me know in the comments. I will continue to do these random rambles. I think a lot of people do seem to enjoy it. I do see comments and likes and whatnot. So I hopefully this is useful and you learned something. And I hope you guys are having a good day out there, cracking packs, playing games, thinking about the universe of economics and everything else that I like to ramble about. Maybe next time we'll talk about James Webb Telescope. It's totally unrelated. I don't know if I could tie James Webb back into this. I do love it. I just don't think I could tie it back into cardboard. So anyways, I hope you guys are having a good one, and I'll see you next time.